Okay, the reading for this week is the next part in our series on Japanese civilization, culture, society, and so forth. And today we will be reading selections from the Kokutai no Hongi, or the Fundamentals of Our National Polity. And the Kokutai no Hongi is a document, a historical document that you see quite often discussed in works about modern Japanese history. It's often referred to in the context of Japan's nationalist discourses of the 1920s, 30s, and during the war. And we will discuss the salient passages of the Kokutai no Nihongi here. And the work was published in 1937, so Shōwa, Shōwa 12, the 12th year of the Shōwa period. If you haven't memorized the dates of the major Japanese periods, historical periods, go back and memorize them now. Shōwa period begins 1926. So when you calculate the dates, go to the Gannen, or the first year of the Shōwa period, 1926, subtract 1, and then calculate from there. So Shōwa, so 1937 in the Western calendar corresponds to Shōwa 12 in the Japanese rendering. Okay. I'll put the dates for the major Japanese historical periods in the description below as well, so you can memorize them there. Alright, selections from the Kokutai no Hongi. Kokutai is usually translated as polity, Hongi, fundamentals, or the essences, and it came out in 1937. Kokutai is a notoriously slippery term. The characters, by the way, Kokutai kuni no karada, the body of the nation, might be a more literal rendering of it. Kokutai is a notoriously slippery term. I think it dates back to classical China as well. Guoti in the Chinese reading. Kokutai is a notoriously slippery term, sometimes translated into English as national polity, and often as national essence. Kokutai, which was hotly debated in Japan starting in the late Tokugawa period, might be best understood, by the way, Tokugawa period 1605, I think, to 1868. Also called the Edo period. Memorize the dates for all these periods if you haven't done so. This is the period of semi-isolation for 260 years. Kokutai, which was hotly debated in Japan starting in the late Tokugawa period, might be best understood as those qualities that make the Japanese Japanese, quote unquote. Alright, so discussions of the national polity, discussions of Kokutai no Nihongi are often situated in frameworks of essentialism and anti-essentialism. In the mid-1930s, a time of social ferment and rising nationalistic thought, the Monbusho, the Ministry of Education, the Monbusho, it's often called, abbreviated as, the Ministry of Education, commissioned a group of prominent academics to write a treatise on Kokutai that would establish an orthodox interpretation of the national essence for the Japanese people. The resulting 156-page pamphlet, Kokutai no Hongi, was published in March 1937 with an initial print run of 300,000 copies, although more than 2 million were eventually distributed in Japan and the Empire. So basically, most citizens of Japan and soldiers that were fighting abroad, and even colonial subjects, were given a copy of the Kokutai no Hongi and sort of forced to memorize it. So many of the Japanese after 1937 would have been familiar with its more salient, important passages. The 2 million were eventually distributed in Japan and the Empire. Kokutai no Hongi was the most important of a series of documents produced by the Japanese government that sought to articulate an official ideology for a nation on the brink of total war. Okay, so if you want to understand the essence of Japanese imperial, sort of semi-fascistic ideology of the late 30s, of the war period, the Second Sino-Japanese War and the war against the West, against the United States and Britain, this is usually the best place to start this document. Alright, and I will put a link to the source of the English translation in the description below. It's from Sources of Japanese Tradition, Volume 2, edited by William Theodore de Barry, Carol Gluck, and Arthur Tiedemann. Okay, and I will give the link to the PDF worksheet as well, which we'll be using in this class. And once again, these worksheets were compiled by somebody at Columbia University, and they're very handy for using in university classes. All right. As always, there's a short version of the excerpt and a longer version. I will read the longer version here. But before I read that, let me read the study guide questions. There are 5 in total. Now I'll read these before I read the text. Question number 1. What do you think this document means by the various ideological and social evils of present-day Japan? Okay, so what ideological and social evils is it referring to? And I'll give you a hint. It's referring to Marxism, communism, democracy, liberalism, sort of these foreign ideas that were demonized during the war period, but you can expound on that in your answers. Question number 2. What does Kokutai no Hongi suggest are the problems facing Japan, and what is the recommended solution? Okay, so what are the problems facing modern Japan in the 1930s, and what is the recommended solution? We'll discuss this in class. Question number 3. Why would the Japanese government have supported ideas like these, especially in the historical context of the late 1930s? So consider the historical context, consider global geopolitics, the situation of the various major Western imperial powers at the time, and consider Japan's attempt to establish its own empire in Asia as a reaction to this. Japan's imperial project, of course, begins in the late 1890s, and we'll review the Japanese imperial history in class. Question number 4. What is the writer referring to when he says, quote, "Our nation early saw the introduction of Chinese and Indian cultures and even succeeded in evolving original creations and developments"? All right, so we'll review the importation of Chinese culture, Buddhism especially, which originates in India, you will know. And we'll review that later in class. And the final question, does the United States have a kokutai, a national body or a national polity or national essence? If so, what do you think it is? Okay, so in other words, is this idea of the kokutai more generally applicable to the situations in other nations and empires and countries? All right. And now here is the selections from the Kokutai no Hongi, Fundamentals of Our National Polity, 1937. Okay, again, this isn't the entire text. The entire book is 144 pages, I think it said in the introduction. These are just 3 or 4 important passages from that work. Okay, introduction. The various ideological and social evils of present-day Japan are the result of ignoring the fundamental and running after the trivial, of the lack of judgment and the failure to digest things thoroughly. This is because since the days of Meiji, so many aspects of European and American culture, systems, and learning have been imported, and too rapidly. Okay, so you remember that Japan's project of modernization and westernization begins with the Meiji period, and this is a period of several decades of intense importation and adoption of European and American ideas about government, philosophy, language, national language, literature, arts, it's just about everything, really. And this document here, the Kokutai no Hongi, is criticizing this project of westernization. This is because since the days of Meiji, so many aspects of European and American culture, systems, and learning have been imported, and too rapidly. As a matter of fact, the foreign ideologies, underlined foreign ideologies, imported into our country are mainly ideologies of the Enlightenment, right? Underline Enlightenment, Kemmu Restoration in Japanese, and this refers specifically to the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, or really beginning in the 17th century and 18th century, and which made its way to Japan in the Meiji period, are mainly ideologies of the Enlightenment that have come down from the 18th century or extensions of them. So we'll discuss the major features of the Enlightenment later in class. The views of the world and of life that form the basis of these ideologies are rationalism and positivism. So these are usually given as 2 defining characteristics of the Enlightenment: rationalism, gori shugi, and positivism, jissho shugi in Japanese. and positivism, lacking in historical views, which on the one hand place the highest value on and assert the liberty and equality of individuals. So Kojin Shugi is another aspect of the Enlightenment, individualism. And on the other hand, place value on a world by nature abstract, transcending nations and races. So universalism is another prominent feature of the Enlightenment. And this document is rejecting that sort of Enlightenment universalism. Consequently, importance is given to human beings and their groupings who have become isolated from historical entireties, abstract and independent of one another. Okay, so according to this critique, the Enlightenment and its rationalism, its universalism, have reduced humans to mere abstractions and alienated subjects that are not connected with one another. Paradoxical and extreme conceptions such as socialism, so it's listing now, giving a concrete list of specific ideological and social evils that are mentioned in the first paragraph. Paradoxical and extreme conceptions such as socialism, anarchism, and communism are all based in the final analysis on Kojin Shugi, individualism, which is the root of modern Occidental ideologies, Occidental meaning Western, of course, the root of modern Western ideologies, and of which they are no more than varied manifestations. Yet even in the Occident, even in the West, where individualism, Kojin Shugi, has formed the basis of their ideas, when it has come to communism, Kyosan Shugi, they have found it unacceptable, so that now they are able to do away with their traditional individualism, and this has led to the rise of totalitarianism, Zentai Shugi, and nationalism, Kokka Shugi, Kokusei Shugi, and to the appearance of fascism and Nazism. That is, it can be said that in both the Occident and our country, the deadlock of Kojin Shugi individualism has led alike to a season of ideological and social confusion and crisis. This means that the present conflict in our people's ideas, the unrest of their modes of life, the confused state of their civilization, can be put right only by a thorough investigation by us of the intrinsic nature of Occidental ideologies, and by an understanding of the true meaning of our national polity, of our Kokutai. Then, too, this should be done for the sake not only of our nation, but also of the entire human race, which is struggling to find a way out of the deadlock with which individualism is faced. Okay, so there's a famous symposium that would take place in 1942, the Kindai no Chokoku, the Overcoming of Modernity Symposium, where they tried to come up with solutions for overcoming some of the problems that are discussed here in this Kokutai no Hongi. Alright, next section on your worksheet is loyalty and patriotism. Our country is established with the emperor, who is a descendant of Amaterasu Omikami, as its center. As our ancestors, as well as we ourselves, constantly have beheld in the emperor the fountainhead of her life and activities. For this reason, to serve the emperor and to receive the emperor's great august will as our own is the rationale of making our historical life live in the present. Life there is probably seimei, might be inochi, and we'll look at the original later. And on this is based the morality of the people. Loyalty, chugi in Japanese, loyalty, which is one of the cardinal Confucian virtues, you'll remember. One of the important Confucian virtues. Loyalty, chugi, means to revere the emperor as our pivot and to follow him implicitly. By implicit obedience is meant casting ourselves aside, so casting aside individualism, putting yourself aside, and serving the emperor intently. To walk this way of loyalty, this Tao of loyalty, is the sole Tao, sole way in which we subjects may live, and the fountainhead of all energy. Hence, offering our lives for the sake of the emperor does not mean so-called self-sacrifice. It's not so-called jiko-gisei, but the casting aside of our little selves to live under his august grace and the enhancing of the genuine life of the people of the state. Okay, so that was the section on loyalty. Next we have the section on harmony. When we trace the marks of the facts of the founding of our country and the progress of our history, what we always find there is the spirit of wa, the spirit of harmony. This character wa, harmony of course is the wa of Reiwa, which is the era that we're now in, the Reiwa era, is the spirit of harmony, or wa. Harmony is a product of the great achievements of the founding of the nation and is the power behind our historical growth. It is also a humanitarian way, inseparable from our daily lives. The spirit of harmony is built on the concord of all things. When people determinedly when people determinedly count themselves as masters and assert their egos, there is nothing but contradiction and the setting of one against the other, and harmony is not created. In individualism, so again the attack on Kojin Sugi, in Kojin Sugi or individualism, it is possible to have cooperation, sacrifice, and the like so as to regulate and mitigate this contradiction and the setting of one against the other, but in the end there is no true harmony. Okay, so cooperation, sacrifice, and so forth are possible in Kojin Sugi societies, such as America and England and other Western nations, but in the end there is no true wa, no true harmony. That is, a society of individualism is one of clashes between masses of people, so kind of a Hobbesian state of chaos where everyone turns against everyone else in these Kojin Sugi worlds, and all history may be regarded as one of class wars. So I get a reference to Marx's theory of class wars here. Social structure and political systems in such a society, and the theories of sociology, political science, statecraft, and so on, which are all their logical manifestations, are essentially different from those of our country. So we are different, we are special, we are not subject to the same laws and problems of modernity, is what it's underscoring here, are essentially different from those of our country, which makes harmony its fundamental way. So it's making the assertion that class warfare, for example, class struggle, is not a prominent feature of Japanese modernity, because Japanese understand the proper value of harmony, wa. Okay, now finally we have the conclusion here. Every type of foreign ideology that has been imported into our country may have been quite natural in China, India, Europe, or America, in that it sprang from their racial or historical characteristics. But in our country, which has a unique national polity, a unique Kokutai, it is necessary as a preliminary step to expose these types to rigid judgment and scrutiny, so as to see whether they are suitable to our national traits. Okay, fudo. Suitable to our fudo. I don't think fudo is used in the original here, but fudo is another cultural climate. Kaze no tsuchi is the kanji for that. Fudo is another term that appears a lot in the writings of the 1930s, and it has kind of similar associations. To put it in a nutshell, while the strong points of Occidental learning and concepts are their analytical and intellectual qualities, the characteristics of Oriental learning, of Toyo, Eastern learning and concepts, are their intuitive and aesthetic qualities. Okay, so whenever you see binaries appear between West and East, West and Japan, write them down, make a list, and inspect whether they are actually true or not. Right. So here we have analytical and intellectual as defining characteristics of the West, contrasted with intuitive, chokkanteki, and aesthetic, bigakteki qualities, right? So analytical and intellectual versus intuitive and aesthetic. And these are natural tendencies that arise through racial and historical differences, and when we compare them with our own national spirit, concepts, or mode of living, we cannot help recognizing further great and fundamental differences. Okay, note that this sort of writing, this sort of simplification of these differences between East and West, Japan and the West, did not end with the end of the war. Japanese in the post-war period and even up into the present still write paragraphs like the one we're reading here. Our nation has in the past imported, assimilated, and sublimated Chinese and Indian ideologies. specifically Buddhism he's referring to here, Chinese and Indian ideologies, namely Buddhism, and has thereby supported the imperial way, making possible the establishment of an original culture based on its Kokutai, its national polity. And just a few more paragraphs to go. The beginnings of modern Western free economy are seen in the expectation of bringing about national prosperity as a result of free individual lucrative activities. In introducing into our country modern industrial organizations that had developed in the West, as long as the spirit of striving for national profit and the people's welfare governed the people's minds, the lively and free individual activities went very far toward contributing to the nation's wealth. But later, with the dissemination of individualistic and liberal ideas, underline that, individualistic and liberal ideas, which have a negative connotation here in this essay, there gradually arose a tendency openly to justify egoism, right, jiga-shugi, jiga, in economic management and operations. This tendency created a chasm between rich and poor and finally gave rise to ideas of class warfare. Later, the introduction of communism brought about the erroneous idea that economics was being the basis of politics, morality, and all other cultures, and considered that by means of class warfare alone an ideal society could be realized. The fact that egoism and class warfare are opposed to our national polity needs no explanation. Only where people one and all put heart and soul into their respective occupations, and there is coherence or order in each of their activities, with their minds set on guarding and maintaining the prosperity of the imperial throne, it is possible to see a healthy development in the people's economic life. Okay, and the final section here, the final paragraph, our mission, sort of a conclusion, a summation of everything he said up to this point. Our present mission as a people is to construct a new Japanese culture by adopting and sublimating. Okay, sublimating, aufgehoben is the German word for this, that a lot of the Japanese intellectuals of the 1930s had Hegel in the back of their head when they're writing this kind of stuff. So overcoming or sublimating Western cultures with our national polity, our Kokutai, as the basis, and to contribute spontaneously to the advancement of world culture. Our nation early saw the introduction of Chinese and Indian cultures and even succeeded in evolving original creations and developments. This was made possible indeed by the profound and boundless nature of our national polity, our Kokutai, so that the mission of the people to whom it is bequeathed is truly great in its historical significance. Okay, that's the end of the this excerpt from the Kokutai no Hongi, and we will discuss it further in class. I will see you then. Goodbye.